Mr. President, on September 16th, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford publicly came forward to share that Brett Kanvanaugh had sexually assaulted her when they were in high school. This was a remarkably courageous act. It was one in which she hesitated to do. It was something that she struggled with. But yet she said time and time again that she believed it was her civic duty, that her sense of citizenship, that act of grace, that feeling that you have a commitment to country, to causes larger than yourself. She put herself forward. She said she was terrified to do so. She said she feared for what the impact would be on her family. And indeed, the impact on her family was terrifying. She endured hatred and bile poured out to her, death threats. She had to leave her family home, split her family up at times. She had to engage security for her own protection. And when Dr. Ford came before the judiciary community to testify, she reiterated that she was afraid. She reiterated how terrified she was, but she stated again and again this ideal of patriotic duty, this ideal of civic responsibility, because she believed that there's something about our institutions that is sacred, and that the highest court in the land, when there could be millions of qualified people in America, thousands of folks, indeed the president's list itself has dozens of folks, she said this person who sexually assaulted her should not go on the highest court in the land for a lifetime appointment. And so she sat before us in the face of endless harassment, glaring public scrutiny into all aspects of her life, the threats against her family. Dr. Ford then gave testimony that was powerful, that to many was jarring. She talked about her private truth, her experience, how it affected her life. She said again and again she wanted to be helpful to the committee. She treated every member of the committee on the Republican side and the Democratic side with respect. She extended them grace. As she was cross-examined by a prosecutor for the Republicans, she engaged with that prosecutor with a sense of decency and honor. She didn't stretch the truth or try to dodge questions. She spoke honestly and candidly and from her heart. She shared details that she said had been seared into her memory. She talked about the narrow set of stairs in that house that she climbed to use the restroom. She talked about being pushed from behind into a bedroom. She talked about the music being turned up louder as she struggled. She talked about Brett Kavanaugh on top of her, hand over her mouth, trying to stop her as she yelled for help. She said that she thought she was going to be raped. She said that she thought she might be accidentally killed. And there was Mark Judge, a person she identified, watching, refusing to help her. Both Mark and Brett were laughing. Dr. Ford described that laughter as searing into her memories. She talked about it as being indelible. She told us she would never forget, and I quote, she would never forget the uproarious laughter between the two, and they're having fun at my expense. I believe her. I believe Dr. Ford. I still believe her. And many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle spoke up, calling Dr. Ford's testimony credible. Many have said that they believe her, or at least that they believe someone assaulted her. They gave credence to the power of that experience, an experience that reflects that of many people who experience trauma. You don't remember it like a video recording, but there are moments that are seared into your mind. People who have experienced trauma, her experience was consistent with that. Even though they Senate hearing would not allow experts to come in. We all know enough now through this experience to know that the way she described her experiences, the things that she remembered, all of that spoke to the credibility of a courageous American doing their civic duty. I was surprised that even the President of the United States called her sincere, called her testimony compelling. That was until he stood at a rally and mocked her. The President of the United States, the most powerful man in the country, perhaps the most powerful person in the world, mocked her and got uproarious laughter. The same thing that was seared in her memory. People laughing at her, the president ignited that in a crowd, made her again the focus of laughter and mocking. And this body that I revere, this body that I love, my colleagues that I respect on both sides of the aisle, this body that was designed to be the world's most deliberative body. This body that was designed to be thoughtful and to take time to analyze. The question is, we heard words about her testimony, but what did those words follow with? Were they like dust in the wind, or were they substantive feelings of believing someone, admiring and honoring their courage for coming forward? Did we treat her that way? Well, if they did believe her, if they did honor her words and her courage and the risk that she took, then this body, that Judiciary Committee of which I'm a part, would have insisted on a full, fair, thorough, and complete FBI investigation that included the many witnesses who stepped forward that could have corroborated her testimony, that could have contradicted Judge Kavanaugh's testimony. This body would have insisted that we take the time to do a thorough investigation, because it's not just about Dr. Ford. There are millions of survivors, women and men, watching how this body will deal with the seriousness of sexual assault. Will we listen to survivors? Will we honor them? Will we honor them enough to fully investigate their charges? And this isn't just charges. These are charges against someone who is up for one of the most important positions in our nation, a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. But no, they did not honor them. If they honored them, they would have insisted on a full FBI investigation. Indeed, when another survivor came forward, Ms. Ramirez, talking about her incident with Judge Kavanaugh, during college days where Judge Kavanaugh diminished his drinking, evasively talked about his drinking, and classmate after his testimony came forward and said he was lying, he was misleading. Republican and Democratic classmates were offended by the way he talked about his behavior. And it was in those college days that Ms. Ramirez said that Judge Kavanaugh exposed himself to her. She identified 20 witnesses that were either eyewitnesses or could have corroborated the evidence. She talked in detail about who could have substantiated her claims. Claims of the kind of drunkenness that we heard public statements from his friends seemed consistent and seemed to implicate the truthfulness of someone who's going to the highest court. And did we honor that woman? Did we honor that survivor by doing an investigation, by going to and at least talking to the 20 witnesses that she put forward? Another woman who was being mocked, another woman who's a victim of hate, spewing at her, belittling her. Did we honor a survivor and simply listen? Interview the 20 people she said could have proved the factual nature of her allegations? No, we didn't. We didn't honor a survivor. We didn't listen to a survivor. We didn't take the time in the world's most deliberative body to listen to a woman's claims and take the step to see if they were true or not. This is what, to me, is so deeply offensive. It's that you have two women who come forward making what claims even the president said seemed, at first, seemed sincere and compelling, but we don't take the next step to fully investigate their claims so we can know what the facts are. The truth is something that the American public deserves. An investigation that gets to the truth is something that the American public deserves, that Dr. Ford deserves, that Ms. Ramirez deserves, that even Brett Kavanaugh deserves, to let the truth come out. But this FBI investigation was part of a larger sham. And people on the right, colleagues of mine, accused Dr. Ford with her sincere testimony. They accused her of being part of a coordinated partisan smear campaign. Now think about that. She told her husband in 2012 about the attack. Was she coordinating somehow with Democrats back in 2012 before Judge Kavanaugh was anywhere near being on the Supreme Court? No. She talked about it to her therapist. She talked about it to her husband. She named that it was Brett Kavanaugh years before Brett Kavanaugh was even on a list of consideration by the president. In 2013, she discussed the assault again in an individual therapy session. And that same year, she told a close friend that she'd been insulted as a teenager while she was trapped in a room with two drunken boys. That's not a coordinated partisan attack back in 2013. In 2016, she told another friend she had been sexually assaulted in high school by someone who went on to become a federal judge. In 2017, she told yet another friend about the assault. She told each of these three friends that a person who had assaulted her had become a federal judge. This does not sound like some kind of partisan smear tactics. This sounds like a woman who has been telling the truth, who has been telling the truth for years about Brett Kavanaugh. And the least this body could do was pause for a moment and not do a sham FBI investigation where you talk to just a handful of people, but do a full FBI investigation because these charges are serious. And meanwhile, millions of Americans, survivors themselves, and others are watching how we deal with something that the Center for Disease Control says happens to 1 out of every 3 women in America. And how do we deal with those charges? 1 out of every 6 men in America. And how do we deal with those charges? When a survivor comes forward, how does the world's most deliberative body honor that? How does it honor that? You want to say coordinated partisan effort, that's what we're seeing here. A coordinated partisan effort to put blinders on, to not seek the truth, and to rush this to tomorrow, to a final vote. Now, long before Dr. Ford's bravery, I was one of those Democrats, one of those senators, one of those Americans that expressed my sincere and deeply held concerns for Judge Kavanaugh's record. I said early that I would not support him. I opposed his nomination. Now then, I opposed his nomination because I was deeply concerned that we have a president of the United States that is a subject of a criminal investigation. And that president picked the one person from his Heritage Foundation and Federalist Society's list that had a view of presidential power that I believed would give that president immunity should issues relating to that investigation come before the Supreme Court. I'm deeply troubled about his views about women's rights to make their own medical decisions. I'm troubled on his views about workers' rights to organize, on voting rights, on civil rights, and on the principle of equal justice under the law. I'm concerned about things that he said about dark money influencing our campaigns, foreign dark money. His record demonstrated very clearly to me that if confirmed to the Supreme Court, Judge Kavanaugh would continue to prioritize the interests of the powerful few over the rights of everyday Americans, that we would see an erosion of individual rights in this country. But I still believed we needed to have a fair and thorough vetting of this nominee, consistent with our constitutional obligations, and it would eventually get to the floor and we would have our vote. And in the many weeks leading up to Judge Kavanaugh's hearing before the Judiciary Committee, many Democratic colleagues and I pushed for the same kind of transparency and a process. Even if we knew where we were going to go, the process should have been fair. The process should have been bipartisan. The Judiciary Committee has a long history in the majority and the minority working together to set ground rules for the committee process. I've watched the Judiciary Committee for many years before I came to this body. It was the one committee, the number one committee I wanted to be on 5 years ago when I came to the Senate. There are legends still on that committee, statesmen on both sides of the aisle, men I respect. But this process, from the very beginning, has been a sham. It has undermined the ability for senators to perform our constitutional duty to advise and consent on the nominee because of the withholding of critical information that I believe is absolutely necessary to evaluate someone. This constitutional duty means that we should have a process that allows transparency into that person's record. The public has a right to know who the individual is that we're voting on tomorrow, what their record is. The public has a right to know. Why would we hide their record from public scrutiny? So step one of the sham was a Republican majority's refusal to request any records from Judge Kavanaugh's time as staff secretary to President George Bush. 0 records, none requested whatsoever. Now, Brett Kavanaugh himself held that position for 3 years, and he called those 3 years of his career, and I quote, the most interesting and most formative years of his career. The most interesting and most formative in shaping his approach to serving as a judge, and in which he presumably advised the president on everything from national security policy to a proposed constitutional ban on same-sex marriages. So many critical issues that are germane to his job and his experience and the formation of his ideals was happening during those times, but we said we could see nothing from his record. Even things that are not classified, not national security, things that would give us a better window in to who he is. Step 2 of the sham was to create a wholly unaccountable process for the fraction of the White House records that the Republican majority did request from Kavanaugh's time in the White House counsel's office. This process was essentially made up, had no reflection in the history of this body, no reflection at all. And so what happened was they put into place a practice where a private lawyer, Bill Burke, who happens to be a longtime political operative, who was a former deputy to Brett Kavanaugh himself, when he was staff secretary, was put in part of the process as a chokehold on documents getting to senators for our evaluation. Most of the documents of this candidate's work product have not been seen by any senator here. In fact, about 90% of his relevant work experience, his relevant work products, has not been reviewed by any senator here. Imagine hiring somebody where you only see 90% of their resume, where you only see 10% of their resume, because 90% is obscure. You wouldn't hire, most of the folks here wouldn't hire an intern in their office if somebody was hiding 90% of their resume. But then there's step 3 of the sham. In conjunction with Mr. Burke, the committee chairman designated 186,000 pages, something that was new, called committee confidential, in order to hide them from the public because they might harm the nomination. Imagine this, the public having a right to know, public needing transparency, and now they're hiding yet again under the name committee confidential critical documents. And they withheld 102,000 pages from the committee altogether, threatening to invoke some nebulous constitutional privilege. And as a result, today, just hours before the final vote, only 7% of Kavanaugh's record from the Bush White House has been released to senators. We are making a decision only knowing 7% of their work product. When women's rights, when workers' rights, when LGBT rights, when voting rights, when affordable health care is all in the balance, we know so little about this candidate. And because of all that's at stake, several of my colleagues and I made the decision to release those documents, but it was still just a fraction. Meanwhile, Judge Kavanaugh's initial testimony before the Judiciary Committee raised my concern because he continued to evade questions, refused to answer our questions. But then after Dr. Blasey Ford came forward, he gave his testimony, and I was stunned. You see, at Judge Kavanaugh's initial hearing in early September, he testified that he wanted to stay, and I quote, 3 zip codes away from politics. He insisted that the Supreme Court must never, I emphasize that word, never be viewed as a partisan institution. But when he came before the Judiciary Committee again last week, Judge Kavanaugh jettisoned his own advice, his own belief in judicial temperament, his own belief in how a judge should behave and be nonpartisan, and he leveled blatantly political accusations. He said the allegations against him were nothing more than, quote, an orchestrated political hit, even speculating that they were motivated by, quote, the revenge on behalf of the Clintons. He cast blame on outside left-wing opposition groups. He told the Democrats that our questioning of him at the hearings had been, quote, an embarrassment. He was belligerent. He was evasive. At times, he was outright deceptive, and at times, he was deeply disrespectful to my Senate colleagues. He displayed the type of fierce partisanship that no American should ever want to see in a federal judge. He went on to say, I quote, almost as if a menacing threat, he said, what goes around comes around. What goes around comes around. Is this someone who could sit on the highest court on the land where political issues might come before him that has not already revealed himself to be deeply partisan, that has not already revealed himself to have a deep-seated anger towards people of certain political stripe? Is this someone who shows the kind of judicial temperament, not for a district court, not for a circuit court, but for the highest court in the land, the court of last resort? He said all of this in response to questions. He didn't say all this in response to questions. This wasn't off-the-cuff comments. This was part of his prepared testimony. Those quotes were in his prepared testimony. In another instance during his testimony, he warned that, quote, this is a circus, he said. The consequences will extend long past my nomination. The consequences will be with us for decades. Well, that's how I want to end. What are the consequences for the way this has won, for a sham process, for a sham FBI investigation? What are the consequences in relation to women who came forward before the world's most deliberative body with credible accusations of sexual misconduct, of sexual assault, of sexual violence? What are the consequences to a body that runs a partisan process, that ignores the truth, that shields relevant aspects of his record, 90% from the public? What are the consequences as they rush to the Senate floor, hoping nobody knows the truth, and ignoring investigating some of the most serious charges that could be leveled against someone, charges of violence, charges of assault. What are the consequences for us in this body behaving in this way? What are the consequences for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who has forever altered her life, for her civic duty, for her patriotism, for her love of country? She sacrificed to come forward, and how do we treat her? This has been an emotional week for so many, and I have seen and heard and witnessed the pain, the trauma that has been dredged up. I've heard from some of my colleagues in private meetings, them telling about dozens of people coming forward to them, having never told people about their sexual assault. And now they come and tell their senator, hoping that their story, that their pain, that they haven't even shared with their spouse, will somehow make a difference in the larger story of our country, will somehow make a difference at this moment when two women were not being listened to, were not letting their stories get the worthy recognition, the worthy investigation. I've heard my colleague after colleague tell me the stories, the painful stories, and I've heard them myself. Friends of mine who I never knew they were assaulted. I never knew their pain, never knew of their trauma. But at this moment in American history, they felt like they had to come forward. They had to tell their truth. Like Christine Blasey Ford, like Ms. Ramirez, they felt now was the time to speak up and stop this nation from making a mistake and try to stop the injustice and try to end a national nightmare where 1 out of 3 women are assaulted, and most of them don't feel comfortable coming forward. They don't feel safe coming forward. They feel like if they come forward, they'll be maligned, they'll be hated, they'll be disrespected, they'll be disregarded. Their charges will be swept under the rug. Their charges will be ignored. But yet a chorus of women and men all across this country have been telling their stories, screaming into this nation, hoping the national conversation will shift in this country from abusing those who have been abused to elevating truth again. This body has had a test, and we are failing that test. This body has had a chance. This body has had a responsibility, and we have surrendered that responsibility. And so tomorrow we vote. And it seems like the die is cast. I heard there were celebrations and cheering in the White House. And in the last few hours, I've also heard the pain and the anguish and the hurt. And I've heard the tears. It seems so unjust. It seems so unfair that 2 courageous women came forward to this body, and we couldn't even investigate their claims. We couldn't even take time to talk to witnesses. And so a lot of folk now are asking me, what now? I want to conclude by reading some words from another painful period, where people didn't know what this body would do. There was injustice in this land, and people didn't know what this body would do. Hundreds of thousands came forward to march and to protest and to sit in, and they didn't know what this body would do. But they stood anyway, and they fought anyway. Sometimes they were beaten. In fact, in one case on a bridge in Alabama, they were beaten and bloodied. One of my colleagues in the other chamber, John Lewis, had his head split open, but they eventually got over that bridge and got to Montgomery, and a man named King gave this speech to those people who were tempted to surrender to cynicism in that time. He gave this speech to those people who wanted to give up. He gave that speech to those people who were hurting. This is what he said. And I quote, he goes, "I know you're asking today, how long will it take? Somebody's asking, how long will prejudice blind the visions of men, darken their understanding, and drive bright-eyed wisdom from her sacred throne? Somebody's asking, when will wounded justice lying prostrate on the streets be lifted from the dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men? Somebody is asking, when will the radiant star of hope be plunged against the nocturnal bosom of this lonely night, plucked from the weary souls with chains of fears and the manacles of death? How long will justice be crucified and truth bear it? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed to the earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so I say to every American that is hurting tonight, every American that's angry tonight, tomorrow we face a defeat, but we shall not be defeated. Tomorrow, it may seem like a loss, but all hope is not lost. I have faith in us as a country. I know it has been a long journey. I know we have suffered much, but I have a faith in this country that is abiding and cannot be destroyed, because we are a nation that always finds a way to move forward, to learn, to grow. And what is dependent upon us doing that is for us to never, ever give up. Never give up. The days ahead will be difficult. It will not be easy. But I have faith in America. We will learn, we will grow, we will get better, we will come together if we never give up. Tomorrow the vote may be what it is, the die may be cast, but I will never give up on this country. I will never give up on women. I will never give up on the ideals and principle that we all swear an oath to, that this nation truly will be one day a nation of liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Mr. President.